He's the executive director at New Civil Liberties Alliance. He's the former chief of staff to a guy we like a lot, Secretary of State now. He was then Congressman Mike Pompeo. His name is Mark Chenoweth. He's authored a piece most recently that caught our attention at Forbes called When the Wolf at the Door is Your Governor. And he joins us now, Mark Chenoweth. Hey, Mark, welcome into the show, sir. Good morning.
Thank you. Good to be with you this morning.
So do I take that to mean you're a Pennsylvanian when I read this?
I am not a Pennsylvanian. I live in Virginia and am a Kansan by birth, and that's how I wound up working for Congressman Pompeo. But I've been paying close attention, and we at the New Civil Liberties Alliance have been paying close attention to what's going on in Philadelphia and the wider state of Pennsylvania as well.
See, Mark, I asked that for an important reason, and I actually highlight something that I have known to be true. I often wonder to myself, am I just too close to this? Do I think Tom Wolf is an extraordinarily abusive governor? And when I say abusive, I mean in terms of his executive authority and the way he's using it, and that he seems to be a really radical fringe guy. I think he's made some really aggressive policy decisions through COVID that are stunning. I mean, stunning and heavy-handed, unlike any governor in the country. And I will tell friends of mine this from other parts of the country, and they kind of look at me like, Chris, I think you spend a little too much time in lockdown. I always feel a little nuts. Like, I really try hard not to be overly hyperbolic if it's not true. But I have felt this guy has been like a closeted, secret radical who just exploded on the scene, an otherwise unimpressive guy, who, when COVID hit, all of a sudden saw the window of opportunity and seized it like no governor. And I'm talking about even Pritzker and Whitmer and Murphy and Cuomo. Wolf is a unique kind of abusive with his authoritarianism. And so I say all that to say, when you write a story about this guy and you're not one of his residents, that confirms maybe a little bit more of the way I was feeling.
Well, I think that's right. We've been asked at NCLA to get involved in cases all around the country. I've lost count of how many different states we've been asked to intervene in. But we have limited resources, and we have to pick and choose. And this was definitely one of the worst examples that we have come across, the way that the governor has just thumbed his nose at the state legislature. And the other thing that I think is important here is there are quite a number of examples around the country where governors have adopted policies that are unpopular, forcing people to wear masks and that kind of thing. But there aren't that many examples, just a handful that we've seen so far, where a governor has cut the state legislature out of the process almost entirely. And that's what we're seeing in Pennsylvania. That's the structural problem that really is going to cause lasting damage.
And sadly, I mean, I saw it coming from downtown, and I think a lot of people were optimistic that and you would think, I think a lot of people thought our legislature would be constructed and set up in such a way. And some people read and interpret our law in Pennsylvania to read in such a way that the governor has a time limit. You know, once he sets executive action in motion, it needs the authority of the legislature to continue. Well, it turns out when the legislature tried to act on that front, he said, nope, I'm going to continue as long as I want. And look, elections have consequences. And when you have a stacked Democrat deck on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, they're going to side with Wolf, who won the day and will continue on his merry way with the legislature powerless to stop him. I mean, it's very, very frustrating. And I just say to people who are angry and frustrated about it, this is why Supreme Court elections matter. This is why state rep and state senator elections matter. And frankly, a lot of people just don't pay much attention to those elections until times like this.
Well, it's frustrating and it's frightening, Chris. You point out that the legislature seemed to be structured in a way to stop him. And I think you're right. I think that the original law only allowed the governor to declare an emergency for 90 days. When he tried to renew that did renew that on June 6th, it was just a couple of days after that, on June 9th, that both houses of the legislature voted to end the emergency session. And you had 60% of the legislature, 60%, that's that's a overwhelming majority of the legislature voting to end the Proclamation of Disaster Emergency. And rather than accept that outcome, the governor, he didn't have to go to the Supreme Court. He chose to go to the Supreme Court to try to do an end run around the legislature. And unfortunately, he was successful in that. And we can talk about the logic of the state Supreme Court's ruling, but I don't think that I don't think that the law supports what the governor is doing, nor does it support what the Supreme Court has interpreted the law to do.
You write, and by the way, Mark Chenoweth is with us, in this Forbes column specifically, when the wolf at the door is your governor. If the statute, you write, under which the governor declared an emergency really allows him to enjoy legislative power that the legislature cannot take back without his permission, that statute is unconstitutional. Explain that. So we have an unconstitutional statute that basically we're treating as law, or our Supreme Court interpreted as law?
Yeah, I think that's right. The way that it's been interpreted now, where the governor cannot have that power taken away, becomes unconstitutional. The reason is that the Pennsylvania Constitution, like the U.S. Constitution, has a very specific provision in it vesting legislative power in the legislature, not in the governor. And it's called a vesting clause. And when that power is vested by the people of Pennsylvania in the legislature doesn't have the power to divest that power to the governor. So if the Supreme Court says the result of the statute is that this power was divested to the governor in a way that they can't take back, if I delegate something to my colleague to do, and my colleague isn't doing it well, or there's some problem, I can take that back without that person's permission. But what the Supreme Court has said is that no, you've delegated this power to the governor, and you need his permission to take it back. I mean, that's what they need to pass a new law, or if the governor needs to what they've specifically said is the governor needs to sign the concurrent resolution. Well, that means that they need his permission to take the power back. And at that point, it's no longer the legislature's power. It's become the governor's power. And it's unconstitutional for the governor to wield legislative power, particularly to wield legislative power in defiance of the legislature.
Mark Chenoweth, again, he's the executive director of an organization called New Civil Liberties Alliance. When the wolf at the door is your governor is an important piece at Forbes you ought to read. I interviewed a state senator from New Jersey and asked him point blank, because, we've been monitoring the activity of Phil Murphy across the river, and I said, do you guys even have a provision in your Constitution that sunsets executive authority? He said, no. They don't. The Republicans have combed through their state constitution, and as he reads it and as they understand it, there is no limit, no time limit on executive authority in New Jersey whatsoever. At least in Pennsylvania, it states it. But I guess in New Jersey, there is no such thing. I began to wonder, if I'm a legislator in any state, and I don't care your party, there's got to be a serious discussion, it seems to me, on how long the executive authority of a governor can be allowed to continue. I should think every state in the union would want to have that discussion.
I think that's right. I think you're right on both counts. I think it's right that every state needs to have that discussion, and I think you're right that there's a real problem here going forward. I think that in terms of what kind of provision it should be, it needs to be a provision where the governor's power ends automatically and it takes a legislative vote to extend it. So, for example...
And by the way, may I just... Mark, could I interrupt you and just say, I want to be clear. I'm for... It's necessary and at times required that the governor have the ability to act in an emergency way. So I want to be clear. I don't say carte blanche, a governor should never, ever have the ability to make an emergency declaration or take emergency action. It's just its time limit. That's all I mean by it. It's not that they should never have the ability. It's an important ability that they need from time to time.
It's a time limit situation, and it's also ordinarily it's a geographically limited situation. If you have some sort of emergency, it's usually a flood or a tornado or something that doesn't affect the entire state simultaneously. But where you have the entire state simultaneously affected by something, it's all the more important that the governor's power be time limited. And whether it's 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, at some point, relatively short point, that emergency power needs to end unless the legislature sees fit to extend it. And even when the legislature extends it, that needs to be for a limited time that then is backed up with a future vote to extend it further. It can't be that the governor is the one who gets to decide when his power ends.
It sounds insane, actually, when you say it that way, but that's exactly what happened. The governor gets to decide when his own edicts end or don't apply anymore. That literally usurps the legislative branch of your government. And then to have the judiciary side with the executive. This is really a microcosm of the federal argument, too. Increasingly, we're finding our legislative bodies are just rendered impotent or meaningless or helpless, and it's a battle between the executive and the judicial. It seems like the legislative branch of our government across the board at the state and federal level have just vanished or been rendered impotent.
It's by design supposed to be the most powerful branch. It has the purse strings, for example, and the executive branch isn't even supposed to be able to spend money without the legislature's say so. And yet even that restriction on executive power, as we see in Pennsylvania and as you properly note at the federal level, is being bypassed.
Mark Chenoweth is the executive director of New Civil Liberties Alliance. I love this piece, When the Wolf at the Door is Your Governor. and thank you for helping me feel not crazy, because I really thought, Mark, that maybe I was too close to it and thought that Wolf, because he's such a, well, I'll say this. Tucker Carlson described him weeks ago on Fox News as the slope-shouldered mediocrity of Tom Wolfe. And I thought, when you watch him and you look at him, he's a terribly quiet, unimpressive, almost diminutive in personality kind of fella. I mean, there's nothing about him, just milquetoast, plain vanilla, nothing charismatic, nothing loud, or, in person you'd think that guy's a dictator. But it's the way in which he works ideologically, not taking press questions. He hasn't taken a single open press question. I mean, until very recently, but through all this executive fiat stuff, all the questions had to be submitted through his, Minister of Information, who then picked them, rehearsed them with him, and pretend read them to him on camera. I really feel like this guy might be the most dictatorial governor in the country. I really do. So thank you for writing the piece.
Well, you're welcome. And I would just say that it may not be at the end of the road yet. One of the things at the end of the piece discusses the fact that there is a federal constitutional provision that guarantees every state in the union a Republican form of government. And of course, that doesn't mean Republican versus Democrat. That means Republican as in a representative form of government. And that's not what Pennsylvania has after this Supreme Court decision. And so there is a possibility of seeking U.S. Supreme Court review. It's a long shot, perhaps, but I do think that what's happened is pretty severe in Pennsylvania, and it might just get the justice's attention.
Mark Chenoweth at New Civil Liberties Alliance, and When the Wolf at the Door is Your Governor. Thanks for your time today, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.